labyrinth of collapsed and dark and unventilated tunnels. It's like I've spent years talking to abalone poachers. I thought what they did was unimaginably terrifying, and I've told a few of them, I was like, guys, this actually makes you look like, this is even more hardcore. But it's not just about the hardcore, the shock, the horror. It's also, I think, to tell a complicated story, people need a person to focus on. So I left South Africa for a couple of years. I came back, and Julian Rademacher is actually here. He's from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I asked him if I could do some work on mining. And thank you, Julian, because they sent me up to Welkom. And I did a report, a sort of criminological report, and met a few people. And then when I was in Welkom, there was a guy that everyone spoke about. They said his name was One Eye. That was like literally his name. And I said, tell me more about One Eye. And the more I heard about him, the more I began to think that there was a narrative version of some of the research work that I've been doing. A story with a person to focus on. And the briefest synopsis I can tell is that One Eye was an undocumented Mozambican man who came here either in his childhood or in his teens, the accounts differ, but was being arrested in slip-slops, torn jeans, and a dirty T-shirt in the 1990s at G Hostel, which is this like apartheid-era migrant hostel that had been sort of taken over and become a sort of Zama gold smelting hub. And through, the opportunities that are available to men like that are like quite minimal. And he grabbed what was available to him and earned money going down into the mines, lived underground for 6 months, reinvested his money back into the economy, established himself as a gold buyer, and more importantly, a provider of food, because when you go underground, you need to get food down there, and that's actually enormously complicated to get 5,000 people's worth of meals 2 kilometers under the earth. And he just made a hell of a lot of money and became so powerful that Eskom was threatening to cut off the municipal account, cut off all electricity to Welkom, to the Machabeng municipality a few years ago. They had the largest unpaid bill in the country. And there was this rumor that One Eye had made a payment to avert the power cuts. And I kind of thought that was taking it a bit far. But like he was the executive mayor of Welkom. That was what people told him as well. He had station commanders in his pocket. He just controlled everything. Magistrates, attorneys, police, traffic cops. He was the biggest patron of one particular KFC, because KFC is like a thing that miners get as a treat underground. Costs like 5,000 rand sometimes for a bucket of KFC. And they would send cars and pick up like 80 KFC buckets at once from this one KFC. And then all the other customers would complain because they'd wait forever for their food. Because they're like, when do you go to KFC? And it's like, sorry, we just got like 80 buckets to make. But I thought the cash payment was an exaggeration until I went to his second murder trial, because he had a downfall. He had too many of his rivals whacked and then was eventually picked up. And at his second murder trial, I met him. And I asked him, is it true? I heard that you paid this thing. And he beamed at me. He denied being a gold smuggler, but he smiled at me. He said, yeah, it was 15 million rand. And he looked so proud of himself. And I don't know if there's anything that like encapsulates the weirdness of an illicit economy, that like this guy was at once like the most ruthless person who like had probably like a dozen people or more killed, and then profited off the labor of these guys who go and live in the tunnels and almost die, but also kept this ailing economy of this abandoned, totally screwed up gold town running. It's a complex set of forces that give rise to somebody like that, and I think he was a useful person to explore this gold economy through. I just got a message from his right-hand man, because I sent him a copy of the magazine, and he said the magazine's now in prison with One Eye, but I haven't heard what he thinks of it. I was hoping to get feedback. Anyway, I've spoken too long. I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, thank you, Kimon. If it was not for people with your unrelenting sense of curiosity in this world, we would not know about a KFC in Welkom where you've spent 5,000 rand on a
nuts,
bucket.
right?
So
I mean, how crazy is
it pays
that?
off to
Yeah,
be
it's absolutely
very irritating to people, and thank you for your piece.
yeah, cool.
But Dr. Munakamwe, I want to turn to you. A lot of what Kimon's just walked us through it's harrowing, to say the least, what someone might subject themselves to for an economic opportunity. And in listening to what some of those motivations might be, your work explores the economic activity of illegal and informal mining, but particularly through a gendered lens. And Kimon, there are a lot of big men in your piece, reservists, associates. But Dr. Munakamwe, I'm interested, the gendered lens you approach also looks at this subject of criminalization, but particularly as it impacts migrant women and children who are also seeking economic opportunity in this sector. And we'd love for you to talk us through what your work has revealed in these conversations.
Thank you so much, and a very good evening to you all. Where I normally also speak, I always say revolutionary greetings. Hopefully it won't stimulate a lot of, So thank you so much to the HSF for organizing this particular platform for us, and of course FNF for supporting, and everybody who made it tonight. There's this particular reason why I want to emphasize that. I'm going to try and touch from the opening remarks by Nicole, then I'll just touch on some of the provocative issues that he has raised in my response to my specific question. I'm sorry if I'm going to take a lot of time, but please forgive me, I'm the only lady here on the panel. Don't punish me when I take too long, no, it's okay. So talking about criminalization, I think I'm so glad that in the opening remarks, Nicole gave us a brief overview of the regularization processes that have happened in South Africa in a bid to try and regularize migrants in South Africa. And I guess the young man you interacted with hopefully is regularized, or perhaps he benefited from the
I'll tell you about it.
Yes, I think I'm just picking up from your hands. I said I'm going to touch on some of the provocative issues that have been raised. So basically what it means is that I've been working in abandoned mines in the Witwatersrand area in Johannesburg for almost 10 years now. My interest actually, I was prompted, much like you were, but by then it was really a sad story. 24 miners from Zimbabwe, one from KZN, that's a local migrant, and one from Lesotho perished at one of the abandoned shafts. I think it was all over the news. The news was awash with that particular case. It was like very outstanding, unlike what we are experiencing now. But that takes me to the question of the rule of law that Inge has actually spoken about. So basically, those people perished. Unfortunately, what was the first response? Nobody would want to report the case to the authorities or call for assistance. Why? Because the bodies that are involved in that particular space have actually come up with their own coping mechanism to avoid any vigilance, or maybe being noticed by authorities. I'm sure you came across it even in your own work. The invisibility part of it. So they took some days trying to rescue, going underground, trying to rescue their own colleagues. But unfortunately, this time around, it wasn't so easy because it was actually some flooding that had taken place. And those who decided perhaps to go underground, they couldn't sustain because there were lots of toxic substances and air that was underground. So they couldn't make it. That's the point at which they had to call for formal, there's authorities to come on board and assist. So what intrigued me, it's not because of the Zimbabwean story or the Zimbabweans that were actually involved there. Of course, I've been working in that particular area on mining. When I started my PhD, I selected the mining sector simply because of its connections to the labor migration system under apartheid. So going in there was just from a human rights perspective. Ubuntu, I had, there has been this particular incident. I didn't know which bodies had been recovered and for who, because in my work as a Pan-African feminist scholar, I'm actually nationally blind. If a local person is in trouble, I will have to go and do, the kind of interventions that I can. And that takes us back to the point of the criminalization part of it. So unfortunately, the bodies that were discovered, many of them did not have paperwork for clearance, even with the Zimbabwean embassy itself or the local authorities. But most importantly, the KZN, the local, Zama also didn't have documentation. They actually struggled to locate his relatives back home. So this is a point that I want to pin down, that of course, for us or for me to be part of and friend to the HSF, like Nicole alluded to, it's based on that Pan-African solidarity spirit that says, when they came for this, you ignored because we are not that. When they came for the Jews, you ignored because you're not a Jew. When they came for, whoever. So in that particular moment, I think what was critical for me was that it was actually a wake-up call for all the NGOs, human rights organizations that were on that space, that it's not only migrants, cross-border migrants that do not have documentation. That was one. But it's also local. And in the case that if that particular individual were to be nabbed by police, they do their raids, it simply means he was going to also get into the same prison, and if not deported, we have heard of cases where local South Africans are deported simply because of how they look. They look more Zimbabwean, then they can be deported wherever, those subjectivities. So this is one point about criminalization of that sector. So basically, the bodies that are involved in there are doubly criminalized for me, in the sense that in some cases they don't have they're not documented, not because they don't want, but because of the restrictive immigration laws, which we actually refer to as institutionalized xenophobia, because like Kimon has actually alluded to earlier, for every struggle, there should be a lawyer, activist, and a storyteller. This is something that I borrowed from the Daily Maverick. Very intriguing and profound article that was shared last week. So basically, the people in this particular case shared their narratives. They shared their stories because obviously people might say, where are those individuals we are talking about? We are actually caring and trying to now share the stories in a way, even though some people would argue that they should be in the room to say it for themselves, but there is obviously a chance for them to have that particular opportunity. So they shared their very, very disturbing stories around gross human violations by police. But what was important for me were two issues. The issue of we don't want to be undocumented. One, we would want to also contribute towards tax. Those 5,000 KFCs, they should be going if they would really allow them to. But unfortunately, I met engineers in that space, qualified engineers, mining engineers. Anyone who has ever bothered to, who has ever wondered who actually direct as to where there is gold or whatever in those spaces. So these are critical skills that South Africa actually has listed on their critical skills list. But what are the barriers, the bureaucracies, obviously, in which we find some dubious conditions? I think the HSF perhaps would have a closer look into that. Barriers, restrictive barriers such as professional body. For one to even get registered with a professional body, it's a mission. Two, there's the issue of Department of Labor, benchmarking. Then the institutionalized xenophobia across all the departments that these particular people have to work with. I think recently there's been a case even with locals that are finding it difficult to even get an ID. Like, for example, the second generation of migrants from countries like Mozambique, whose perhaps fathers were working in the mines, that intergenerational aspect of mining, in which the sons also want to come back and work in the mines, and their parents were granted some amnesty in 1996, but still it becomes a problem. Perhaps there's the DNA test and all those kind of things. So yeah, those are some of the issues that I would really want to put on the table. But the second part of criminalization is that which is within the DMRA, the DMR, the aspect of the bodies that are actually involved in extracting what they call precious minerals. They don't have a problem if I go out with my hoe and go and dig clay there. Nobody cares, Even if I'm saying I'm going to look for mice, they don't care. But they care about the outcome. The moment I come up with a small pebble, precious one, then I'm criminalized straight away. So you can actually see the reason why I had to provide this kind of narrative that goes round and round is just to try and put us into the picture as to what exactly is at hand, what do we mean by criminalization, and why do we need a regulatory framework? It's not only South Africa that is facing that quagmire. Last month in August, we were at the SADC People's Summit where we hosted a seminar session, because they said they've never experienced that before, they've never had such a session on ASM, and of course it was very thought-provoking, but obviously something that, the powers that be are not very comfortable with us discussing. Why? Because there is all this hype around new minerals, the transition minerals for climate justice, climate change, lithium, who is taking that lithium? So it's not a very easy story like what Kimon has alluded to say or to talk about. But this is part of the work that we have been trying to, raise from a policy perspective, because the scapegoat, it's always like, oh, there's no regulatory framework. So even, I think those who are arrested, my colleagues will tell me from the work that they've been doing also, there's no specific laws to prosecute them. So it's either you pay a bribe, that 5,000 KFC, or they have to invoke certain particular laws. Like, for example, when they find you now with large chunk of money, you are actually prosecuted under the money laundering laws. So outside of everything else, and one would wonder as to who are the West looters and money launderers. Obviously the ruling elite. They can keep thousands, millions under their pillows in their homes. But if myself as Janet am found with large Even if it belongs to me, I've worked hard underground because I don't even know. I'm just now talking like there at the Zamazama. I don't even know when I go down whether I'm going to come back. And now when I have to also enjoy the little that I've managed to extract, I become criminalized simply because those spaces actually are ring-fenced for certain particular individuals. So that talks about the rule of law, Inge. The rule of law is not that today, that's when we are beginning to see people attacking human rights defenders like Nicole and HSF team. Or Siri, we know lawyers for human rights, everyone who has been trying to champion rights for those who are actually like in the marginal, in the periphery, are always criminalized or attacked or so forth. It has been happening in those abandoned shafts where police would actually brutalize human beings simply because you are coming out, you are dirty with it or whatever, you are a criminal, even if you haven't committed anything that constitutes a crime. So how many times have people reported around those issues? Human rights defenders have been reporting those cases. Nobody cares because these individuals, most of them are coming from across the borders. So they are not human. They don't have rights according to whoever. That's why people I don't mean they don't have, but in courts, there we don't care even if police brutalize and beat them up to death. We don't care. I came across very graphic stories where there's impunity. As long as you kill a Zamazama, there's no problem. So I think I'll share one of my articles that was loaded more. I came to a super saturation point whereby everyone that I interview, I speak to, whether women, they'll talk about police brutality first as their main concern, that they would really need the media or whoever cared to intervene, the lawyers, whoever cared to intervene. So the rule of law in a constitutional democracy is one of the key issues that we need to take note of. That it didn't start like today or last year or this year when they start targeting, activists or, human rights. It has been happening, and we certainly need to have more and more of these seminars, and of course, political education. For those who do not understand why people are risking their lives, they don't even enjoy going underground and spending 6 months, some up to 6 months, and like Kimani.
2 years.
Yes, by then, the time I went, I also almost was tempted to go underground, but I won't tell you why. I will talk about it later. The bread, a loaf of bread was claimed to be selling at 1,000 rand. A bottle of water, 500. These are the realities. And I won't get much into the other issues for now. I think I have said the women part of it. We all know that all women are exposed to gender-based violence. And it's even worse for migrant women because of that double criminalization. Many suffer silently or even die, sexually harassed, violated, but at the end of the day, they can't go and open up cases. The more they even go anywhere near, then they're locked up simply because they don't have the document, and they are involved in illegal activities. So I won't get deeper into that. Perhaps I'll leave it for now until when
Thank you, Dr. Munakamwe. And I think you've taken us quite a bit already into some food for thought when we get into our discussion. And I've made a note of things to come back to that I'd also like Kimon and Prof to respond to. But Prof, I'm going to turn to you. A lot of your work has offered an economic history of the special place of mining, as you call it, in African economies. And in the past, you've employed a multifaceted lens, both from a political economy point of view, but you've also explored important questions of race, masculinity, power dynamics, in understanding the machinations of the sector. Both Dr. Munakamwe and Kimon have spoken about the question of trust. And from a social lens, trust forms a part of this conversation, whether between citizens and their states, or the financial institutions of their states, the question of what motivates one to cross a border and seek an economic opportunity in gold mining. How important is this question of trust in this conversation, and what has your work revealed with some of this?
Thank you. That's very kind of you to accommodate my obsession, and thanks very much for HSFT for the invitation. Nice to be here with Kimon and Janet. I think that this problem is actually all about trust, and it's about trust infrastructures, or perhaps a better way of thinking about it, this is to go back to Keynes's old arguments from 100 years ago, in which he said, lecturing, especially the advocates of the gold standard, I wasn't there, none of us were there, but he said, you people are you have a kind of barbarian's view of what value is, and you think that you can rely on gold because you don't trust the experts who make decisions, you don't trust the decision makers, you don't trust your institutions. And what's driving this problem of artisanal gold mining, it's actually, the gold mining side of artisanal mining is relatively recent, I think. The explosive growth is this comprehensive collapse of trust in financial institutions, especially in the global south. Right? I hate that word, I hate that phrase, because there's really nothing. We don't share anything with Kazakhstan and Turkey, except this thing that we don't trust our governments. And which means they've turned to gold really kind of fanatically. So just to give a sense, I'm not sure what the policy takeaway is, but this problem is a much bigger problem than the South African problem. So the government estimate we have 16,000 artisanal miners, probably wrong by a factor of 3. Probably we have 50, 60,000, but it's not much more than that. Gold mining has always been very difficult in South Africa. It's really dangerous. You cannot just dig a hole. You have to go down 3,000 feet, 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet, and the earth is likely to kill you while you're down there. It commonly moves and kills people underground. So no one is doing this as the first choice, as a survivalist strategy. They're doing it because they're desperate, and there are relatively few of them. Zimbabwe, we have 50,000. The best estimates are for 1.5 million artisanal gold miners in Zimbabwe, 1 million in DRC, 1 million in each of the Sahel countries, right? So Sudan, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, that whole Sahel is basically being repurposed, reworked around surface artisanal entrepreneurship, in which people dig for gold using metal detectors. So I can buy a metal detector and find a response and start digging. And there's absolutely no question that it's changing how all of those countries work. We get the model of artisanal mining, the formalization, we get it from Ghana. It comes from this guy Hilson's work. He's done a lot of work there saying Ghana can, but the Ghanaians also have reached a point where essentially the demography means that the regulation is actually impossible, cannot be managed. They have 500,000 to 1 million people, and it's starting to affect how agriculture works in Ghana. It's causing very obvious national political panic, much worse than ours, right? We worry about it off screen. The YouTube videos is where people look at it. It's not a big national crisis. Here, in these other countries, it's really existential, I think, is probably the best way to describe it. So let's put that question there and we'll think about it. And the other thing important about this is these are kind of mobile frontiers. They move and they start on the outskirts of states, and they get more and more powerful as they draw in more and more people. And they repurpose infrastructures, road systems, transport systems, political boundaries, firms, all of those things. So the real driver of this is demography on the one side. It's people without work, tens of millions of people without work. You can't expect that to be easily resolved. There is no easy policy to fix it. And then the flip side is the value of gold itself. So you know this, if you're my age, you can remember, right? You remember they used to put the gold price, the SABC News, though, a guy would come on and tell you about the ANC, the terrorist organization, and then they'd say, and the gold price is $333 an ounce, and you'd get the rand price, and that rand price was the measure of the viability of our economy. That's how we thought about it, right? Gold has gone from Anglo-American killing price of $350 an ounce in 2001 to $2,000 an ounce. So sevenfold increase in the space of 20 years. And especially since 2008, the gold price has exploded, right? And we're not beneficiaries of this. We hardly export gold anymore. Ghana exports more gold than us, a lot of it from artisanal miners. So the big driver actually is the price. But the other thing that we know a lot, and the research is incredible. There are whole universities in Belgium, in Germany, in England, studying these gold fields. We know enormous amounts about them. We are confident. Having done big randomized trials of the gold fields, we know people are earning $4.50 a day on average. That's what they basically earn from the little bits of grams of gold at $4.50, so something like 90 Rand a day, 2,000 Rand a month. And that means that the first thing you can be really confident about is we could solve this problem if we could spend 30 million Rand a month and just give it to people and say, please don't mind, we'll give you money, go away. Of course, unfortunately, this is not an easy thing, as we know. We have a really big problem managing this kind of difficulty. So the price that people get is really the determinant. So the famous story in African economic history is that African producers get virtually nothing of the global price for the commodity that they produce. So if you take cocoa, there's something, we don't know the exact numbers, but something like 20 million people produce cocoa on the African continent, and they have done for a century. They get about 2% of the global price of cocoa. The countries get about 6%. The rest goes to rich corporations, mainly based in Switzerland and in Belgium and the United States, right? The 94%. There's a $100 billion cocoa economy, but the cocoa producers get nothing. Now, this is the really important fact. Gold miners get more than the metropolitan price. Not always, but usually. Right? So if I'm selling gold in Ghana or in Mali or in DRC or in Stilfontein, the dealer will pay me more than the London price. Now that's the thing you really have to, so what that reflects is this value chain above the producer, which is all about what gold as money can do, right? And what it can do, it can wash assets. You've got illegal assets. You've got illegal money that's come into your family for some reason. You don't want the government to know about it. You don't want whoever it is, the Barclays in London to know about it. So what do? You turn it into gold, you move the gold to Dubai, someone will put dollars in your Swiss bank account. It's very powerful. You can avoid tax, you can transfer money offshore, which is the real demand all of these families are looking for, how to get their money out of the country. So that value, that above the metropolitan price, is really the measure of institutional crisis, of the fact that people don't trust anyone in the system, and they're looking for monetary instruments that will allow them to get away, essentially, from the predicament that they confront. I'm going to come back to Bretton Woods. I'll probably run out of time. I know. When you start talking, time stops. All right, quickly. Two more quick points. Everywhere, this is intensely politicized, but it is especially intensely politicized in Zimbabwe. Right? It's become the fundamental source now of power for ZANU-PF and for the government institutions. So our policy, if we have one, I'm afraid, needs to work there. It doesn't really need to work here. It's got to fix what's happening in Zimbabwe if we expect not to have to deal with this problem here. And then the last quick point, there's a famous argument that these minerals are generating violence. It's famous. It's one of the reasons why the American Congress introduced this kind of supply chain surveillance and licensing. They said you can't put everything except cobalt. You can't use lithium in an iPhone unless you're confident it didn't come from some child slave who's working in a mine in Congo. And so big American corporations all quickly went to check, said to their dealers, don't buy from people who are sourcing their lithium in Congo. But they didn't do it to cobalt, and they didn't do it to gold. And they still can't do it to gold. It's very difficult, in fact, to kind of generate, because no one wants to be honest about where they got their gold from or who they're selling it to. So when this was being pushed in the US Congress, these very good researchers all over the continent are saying, "Ugh, this is just rubbish." People are doing gold mining not because they want to fund political revolts, but because it's a way to work. I can earn $5 a day in an artisanal gold mine. If I work in a cocoa field, my whole family is going to earn 80 cents. It's really an uncomplicated problem. Gold mining is there because it's better work. But if you look at the correlation between artisanal mining and the violence in Sahel, the violence in the DRC, and even the violence in Zimbabwe, it's pretty clear. The bad guys come for the gold miners, right? And it's really a high risk, politically high risk problem. This is existential. These coups are following essentially the expansion of the artisanal mining frontier. It's not. I know it sounds like I'm dramatizing this. It's a big political problem. This for us. It's not something we can easily walk away from. Let me stop there, and people can make their comments and criticism and see. Yeah.
Thanks, Prof. Usually on a panel, we have to try and find ways
what the good outcomes are.
to get the panel to engage with each other. But I think quite organically, each of the panelists have responded to and engaged. Kimon, very quickly, I want to come back to you. Your article touches on a lot of these dynamics, from the fact that many of us might own a piece of jewelry that includes gold that was mined illegally, and maybe we don't even know it. But the question of how you source where the mineral came from in the first place is hard. But particularly on this point of price as the prime driver and incentive, all but going down the shaft yourself, you were very close to the motivations for the reasons why one might put themselves in such a precarious position. And on the other side of that are enablers. I think the panelists both have spoken to, there has to be a market that exists, right? There has to be a buyer. Unfortunately, the conversation about criminalization is very much focused on the miner and how to get their activity right. In your experience, could you tell us whether you came close to uncovering the dynamics of the other side, the market?
Yeah, sure. So there is a market. There's a huge market for gold, which is kind of preposterous in the sense that it's just valuable because people have decided it's valuable. So it's this thing that we stuck with, which is like how the global economy became integrated was everyone joined the gold standard in like the 19th century. And that demand remains and has risen because the gold price is higher now, and dynamics around the Ukraine war we were talking before have actually like driven that way higher recently. So gold is a thing that people want and covet. On the other side, the motivations for climbing into a 2-kilometer deep fucking hole are absolute desperation. Like, it's an absolute last resort industry. A lot of South Africans envy the money that Zamas make, but are not prepared to do that themselves. You know, in Welkom, the ways that people would get into pits would range from being lowered down by rope behind a reversing vehicle, or climbing down a rope ladder made with like rubber tires and ropes, or climbing down the buntings, which are these like massive steel girders that used to hold these cages that would take the black and white mine workers down in a ratio of like 15-1 to go toil underground, and the cages have long ago been dismantled, and now there's these massive girders, and guys will slide down them, down 2 kilometers. And there's surveillance camera footage of guys climbing down, and then on the horizontal beams, these like corpses that have wrapped around the girders because they've fallen 500 meters or whatever. So these are like, you know, desperation and market. And then there is a facilitator layer. There's an entire illicit economy that's kind of established as a mirror image of the legal economy. In a way, there's security, there's mine security. Now mine security is predominantly Basotho gangsters wearing color-coded Marashi blankets who seize control of the gold mines, and they're there because their forefathers were brought there by the hundreds of thousands. So that's the security layer. There's a food logistics layer who are like doing the catering, which is in the past it was like all the South African maize subsidies were trying to find ways to like cheaply get maize underground to give workers 4,000 calories a day because they were sweating in 50-degree heat or whatever. Now there's a food logistics line, which is the David One-Eyes of the world, going and shopping and buying all the loaves of bread in Welkom and flattening them so that they can get stuffed into the overalls of legal mine workers who are going down that shaft and then scurrying it along down there and then getting that huge markup that you spoke of. And to this point of criminalization and brutality, there's a whole spectrum of participants. And zama zama is like a kind of useless analytical word I've come to realize, because David Wana is a zama zama, as is a guy who I called Simon in the story. He's a Zimbabwean dude who carried out 15 of his mates over a 2-week period when the Welkom security establishment managed to shut down the supply of food, and like hundreds of people died underground. And then he made these like 24-hour return journeys carrying food, carrying dead bodies out. Like, they're completely different people. They're completely different. There's a mine boss and there's a mine laborer. But there's a shitload of brutality, like even by the standards of mining in South Africa, which has an exceptionally brutal history. I mean, we sort of take it as rote, but like I spent time in archives, and you guys will know this as well. Like the dehumanizing, underpaid, just mass-produced black labor and like wreckage that the mining industry depended on. That's also kind of continued through to the present, in the way that like the brutality that these miners face from the cops and the authorities, sure, because it's easier to go after the little guy and like go corpse dump a few guys in the West Rand after there's like one of these episodic moral panics about illegal mining, like that mass rape in Krugersdorp or whatever. Then there's like 2 weeks of front page and everyone treats it as a national crisis. So they get, stamped around. But they're also facing like unimaginable brutality from the people who have seized control of that economy, because that's what happens when an economy goes into shadow, and when it becomes unregulated and ungoverned, then it's just like the threat of violence that basically gives command of the thing. So there's Mauritian gangsters who move in with their AK-47s, like bought from the Lesotho Defense Force, and factional fights underground of different mining groups are only allowed to work in different areas. It sometimes get over-exaggerated, but there are very credible accounts of human trafficking where someone will get signed up, like some guy living in a mountain village in Lesotho, someone will come and say, you want to come work in the mines? Like my cousin works in the mines, we've got a job for you, your family gives me some money, they get brought in, and then they get led to the end of a pit and they say, okay, you've got to climb now. And if they don't climb, the first guy gets shot and kicked down the pit. Like, this happens. Yeah. So there's a sort of a metastasizing violence that happens throughout this industry that's not all from the authorities. It's like the whole, the value of this mineral and the residual value of this mineral, and then the collapse of a legal industry that's going to harvest, like mine it. And even at $2,000 an ounce or whatever, the crazy thing is nobody wants to invest in the South African mining industry for political reasons, because they don't know that they've got land tenure, because they're scared about, if like a more radical faction of politicians are going to come to power, the mining industry is very standoffish. And so we still have, I think, the biggest proven gold reserves in the world, but nobody wants to invest here. So it's not profitable to like reline a shaft and put an elevator back down that the guys are currently climbing down the bunting. But there's still an enormous amount of gold there that is profitable to mine out if you're a guy with no money and you're going down there with like a pick and a shovel and maybe a jackhammer. So then there's like this economy of scale and of politics that means that I just see the future of gold mining in South Africa as being one of zama-zamas, especially when you factor in the corruption, the rule of law, and all of that. And I think that's very dark. I think that's very dark. And the people who suffer most are these people who are not criminals. They're just men and sometimes women. I mean, the women do a lot of work at the surface, in my experience, like crushing and grinding and getting mercury poisoning. And then having this kind of criminal apparatus, and then the criminal apparatus, by the way, includes the police who also go shake them down and beat them up and rob them and take their gold. And one of One Eye's favorite moves in Joburg was he'd just like corrupt enough of the police force, and then there's like other kingpins, and then he'd say, okay, that guy, go get his gold. So then the police go, blue light, pull up at your house, like take all the gold, and never gets booked in and just goes straight to One Eye. Like the police are just working for him as like an extortion racket of their own. And because the economies of Lesotho and Zimbabwe and Mozambique are like so catastrophic and worsening, I don't see that flow of people kind of lessening at any stage. And then that feeds into this like completely berserk and unhinged, but also understandable xenophobic narrative, because people living in these communities do see this incredibly violent criminal infrastructure. That's often the only economy in town. Like, so Welkom was an extreme case. Like the car dealership shut down when they closed illegal mining. Like the formal economy was completely dependent on that illegal gold flow. But like somewhere like Kagiso on the West Rand here, like I was there after this mass rape story that happened last year. There was like a really weird thing where there was like a film shoot. I don't know what the hell was going on this like desolate dune in Krugersdorp. Like the most terrifying place. I drove past it. I was like, hell no, I'll never go up that dune. Who's going to take like scantily clad women for a music video? Very fishy. But like a week afterwards, I went there and I was taken to Kagiso by a Zimbabwean gold dealer. And there were hundreds of men grinding their pendukas behind the shacks. There were guys crossing the road at sunset with their bags of gravel. Those are shallower mines, so it's not like the Welkom thing where you have to go underground for like 2 years. They can do like little few-day trips. The whole economy was happening. The next day, the ANC got behind because there was this rising tide of xenophobia, and the ANC organized a protest march, which like, how ridiculous, like it's your government. And they said, we're marching against Zamazamas, we're marching against xenophobia, and then you guys saw the headlines, you saw what happened in Krugersdorp. I think several people died, houses were set alight, people were beaten up, and there's this like sort of spasm of like ridding the community of this evil Zamazama scourge, but then like they're paying rent, they're buying amagwinya, they're like renting cars, they're taking local girlfriends and paying them more than the South African guys can. Like this is where the money goes. And so then it comes back. And over and over and over again, if anyone gets fucked up, it's the little guy and the woman. But I think there's a very structural sort of momentum here where I see this as the future of mining in South Africa, and I think that's very bleak, and I hope I'm wrong.
Thanks, Kimon. I'm aware that we're close to time, and I'll ask for an indulgence from our panel as an act of reciprocity, that our audience is given sufficient time to ask the questions.
Are we
I
out of
know
time
there might be many. You guys talk a lot, but it's super interesting.
Can I say one, two things?
Absolutely, Doc. I'll come back to you. I just want to make some food for thought, both for the audience and for the panel. There's a lot that's spoken about this absence of the regulatory and policy framework. And I'm sure there's strong opinions about, well, what can that achieve in the face of this very complicated and multifaceted contemporary historical problem. There is a policy that's come out in March 2022, and I know Dr. Munakamwe, you've been part of that process. It's the artisanal and small-scale mining policy. And it's a document that seeks to formalize artisanal mining. It seeks to introduce some definitions, distinctions between small-scale miners, artisanal miners, but maybe importantly, it omits a lot of the people we were talking about tonight, the illegal miners, the Zamazamas, and the question of how to bring those already involved in the sector within the remit of a policy environment is an important point I'd like you to reflect on, as well as the onus on other areas that require harmonization with this policy, social development being one of them. Right? A policy on its own that's trying to formalize a sector, but isn't speaking to the socio-economic, socio-political dynamics attendant to the sector. You know, how far will this go? And then maybe come on to in your article, there's a one-liner from AA to ZZ, and our audience are clever, so they might figure out what the AA refers to in respect of a mining company, but the ZZ is Zamazama, and it speaks to this point you make about what is the future. And what does it look like? So those are just some food for thought. I think as you answer questions, feel free to bring in the other interjections that you wanted to make in the course of your conversation. But I'll take a first round now.
Sure.
And we'll go as the comfort of the panel is. So maybe we can start with 4 questions to start, if that's okay with the panel. And
Look, I feel like we've spoken so much. I don't mind sitting here for longer.
there you go. So that's a great way forward. I will ask one indulgence from the audience. If you're rising, to do a quick introduction as you're comfortable to do. And also just to let us know if you're making a comment or asking a question. The HSF was deliberate in choosing this panel, so we want to know if we have a 4th panelist that we didn't know we invited. So if you're making a comment, we just ask that you keep it relatively brief. If you're making an interjection, having a debate, that's fine. And if you're asking a question, just who you intend the question to be directed at, or if you'd like the question to go to the panel. Who has got our roving mic is here. So, hands.
Perhaps we need to give them some more.
See one hand in the back.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Kwezi Skoni from the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. It's a very simple question to the panel. So South Africa has been, our mining industry, there's a discourse that emerged like in the 2010s that it's a sunset industry. So in your sort of opinions, do you think that there's a parallel or corollary relationship between sort of sunset industries? Well, is it a sunset industry? Probably, you know. And is there a parallel relationship between that and the emergence of sort of illicit economies that emerged from that? Thanks.
Thanks, Kwezi. That's a question to the panel. Yep, cool. Anyone else? We'll just keep going if we don't have questions. Titsi, I see your hand.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for an extremely riveting conversation. I mean, being from Zimbabwe myself, the whole time I was just like, oh my goodness, this is, you know, something that is plaguing, you know, my brothers and sisters in this country. So my question is around the regulatory framework. Oh, I didn't introduce myself. Sorry, let me go back. My name is Tutsi, and I'm from Invest Africa. And so my question is around the regulatory framework. Are there any other countries that we've seen globally that have successfully implemented a framework that addresses some of the challenges that you guys brought up this evening? Thank you.
Thanks, Titsi. Nicole.
Thanks. I'm not going to do another introduction. Just to say, in response to Keith's observation, and the fact that there seems to have been a sort of inability to insist on sort of locating the provenance of the gold, in contradistinction to other minerals, right? Is that just a failure in sentiment of a kind of effective campaigning? Is it possible to imagine that, as with kind of diamonds and the campaigns against blood diamonds, that one might be able to establish a kind of more effective sentiment that insists upon locating the provenance of gold?
Good evening. I'm Juliet Briggs. I'm from the HSF. My question to the panel is, I wanted to understand, how does the gold get from being in the iron, being in the ore, in the rock, to being refined, and then does it ever enter the formal industry, or does it always remain sort of undocumented gold that then can be moved around, as Professor Breckenridge said, it can be sent to other countries, or does it actually then at some point enter sort of the formal gold industry and get turned into Krugerrands and gold bars and that type of thing? Yeah.
Thanks, Juliet. So we've got our 4 to start, and it seems all 4 are general questions for the panel. So let me start with the first question, and feel free, whoever would like to take it and whoever would like to respond to it as well. This is the question of, is gold mining a sunset industry, and what of the future of illicit economies, if anyone would like to take that?
I think for me, thank you very much for that particular question. I just want to be a bit of a devil here now. For me, I think lithium or cobalt, whatever the transition minerals, are slowly becoming the gold of the day. And I think we might even speculate some movements further north from South Africa. I'm just putting it on the table for us to reflect, particularly in light of xenophobia as well. Because why am I saying this? There are many of these South African companies that are now investing in all these countries that surround them, where lithium, cobalt has been found. So perhaps that's going to change the narrative of how South Africa is perceived even within this whole complex, political economy of mining. It's no longer that, special location or position that used to be, where everybody will be rushing to Wenela, to Mzansi, Egoli. Okay, I wrote some article some years back around all that glitters in Egoli is not gold. So I think for me, reflecting also on the issue of the illicit transparency and trusts, I think there are so many lessons that could be actually, drawn from how gold, these precious so-called special minerals, have been exploited by the powers that be without benefiting the, ordinary people. I think as we move towards all this hype around the new gold, which is lithium, I don't know, we have to vote, lithium or cobalt, since they said there are some limitations to the use of lithium, depending on whether it has been mined through child labor, but who cares?
No one cares.
Who cares? And that talks to the question of, the fundamental question around the hierarchy. The global value chain. I wouldn't get into that because I don't want to take much time. But my question is, who cares about human rights violations in as far as these minerals are concerned, as long as capitalism has to sustain itself? Obviously, it has to maximize profits by exploiting, like what Keith has mentioned, around how much are women paid. A study in the DRC actually showed that they are paid an average of $8.50 per day. Those are women working in the cobalt industry, where there is high exploitation of child labor. The children are paid $2.50. And yet what happens? They are still working and trying to avoid the police. Who cares at the end of the day whether the gold that somebody has been trying to dodge the police finds itself, or the cobalt and the lithium? Do you think they will even bother to ask as to how did this lithium, all these reserves got to be where they are? But of course, we understand the rhetorics that has always been said by these politicians in as far as regulating the sector is concerned. In fact, the mining industry, we have noted recently the gold mafia in Zimbabwe. All along we thought now that perhaps they lie that because of the so-called sanctions, which do not even exist, they're not selling gold, they're not trading in gold. But funny enough, there are always ways in which it has to, they have to sell, not directly through those markets, but obviously there are people who are interfacing with the very same people at the point of production and extraction. Who are they? The buyers. Who own the buyers? Who do they work for? The political elites. This is why you see that all these are some of the issues that I came across. All these, what do you call them? The raids that they do, they're actually very well managed in such a way that you find that the very same buyer who was at the same space where the ordinary Zamazama has been nabbed, they are walking scot-free. How is that so? Hence my question is, who cares about child labor and all these principles around we can't buy, anything, a product of lithium or gold that has been mined, through this way, or, we have had cases of the bloody diamonds in Congo, but did people stop buying or trading with Congo?
Can I jump in there?
That's a question. Yeah.
Because one thing to that, who cares? Like I said cynically, no one cares. I actually think everyone cares. Like no one wants to drive an EV that they're doing for climate change reasons and know that it's like from child labor. But there's this like really clever trick that these supply chains are able to do, which is to persuade people that they aren't contributing to the problem. I think like most people don't want a blood diamond. Most people don't want gold from Zamazamas. I mean, maybe a few people do. I don't know.
But the point I'm making.
But there's this infrastructure
who cares, and it goes back to the question of regulatory framework.
Right on.
If really, I'm concluding now, if really our political leaders cared, do you think by now we couldn't have a regulatory framework in place? So everybody is taking advantage of that lacuna in the policies and the legislations to, kind of further advance their own individual political and socio-economic interests. If really our governments cared, government started, I'm talking about where I was last time. If they really care, obviously, Keith raised something very fundamental, which I was tempted to respond to earlier, around the social security or social development you actually further. Wouldn't it be fair enough to say, okay, instead of women and children toiling, inhaling dust, can we find other means of subsidizing? And we all know who wouldn't be qualifying for that, the migrant woman and the migrant child. So it all goes back to that double criminalization, double vulnerabilities. So those are some of the key questions, which is why you find high presence of migrants in those particular spaces, because they have no alternative. They don't have a social grant, they don't have a child grant, they don't have any other means unless if they go to those particular spaces. So hence, for me, the key point here is that this reluctance or, kind of paying a blind eye towards crafting policies and laws that relate to this particular regulatory framework, it's all because everybody is, who is supposed to care? I mean, everyone cares, like everyone here in this room, but those who are in those positions of power, they're actually finding some ways in which they're benefiting at the expense of everyone else. So do you think they would care about having a regulatory framework in place? We worked around that through a research that was commissioned by the Oxfam South Africa. That was in 2017. When the department actually called out for submissions from communities, we went out for consultative dialogues, consultative session, engagements with communities. Obviously, there were huge, long lists here. What happened last year when they came up with that draft of theirs? They had to make sure they ring fence, they're selective on what to include in those policy framework and what not to include. And we know very well that here in South Africa, the communities and civil society is very highly mobilized. So it was so clear that communities said, no, this doesn't reflect our views. Yes, they were consulted. We made formal submissions to the department, but what came out is something that is to the interest of the powers that be. So these are the issues that we need to put on the table. We have so many big minds in universities and whatever, but the government is very selective on who and at what point they really want this to happen, because we have specialists who could actually quickly come out with some studies and, go through that process of policy, making. But what stops them from doing that if the economy is really grounded historically and in contemporary South Africa on the mining sector. So that kind of, I don't know, complacent, I don't know in a way what's the best way to say it. But it's very difficult because to really deal with it. But it also points to the reason why we have, high levels of violence in various ways. Thank you for raising that. I can't stop without talking about that. Because every role player is now taking advantage of that lacuna, So everybody is to their own benefit. Those who really are genuine and want the regulatory framework so that they can operate and contribute towards tax meaningfully to the economy without facing any barriers, they are now disadvantaged and clubbed together. Hence, the sector today, it's called illegal, criminalized. I remember last year when I had some debate on television where I was told that, you know what, Janet, we can't talk about this. These are outright criminals. They belong to prison. Finish and clear. And that was a government official, just to close me to censor my views around that area. But the story of that innocent woman, that innocent child, that innocent man who is trying to earn a living, in a very, legal, of course, to them they tell you that we are zama-zamas. Zama-zama means we are trying to earn a living. So they would tell you that we are not criminals. So those are some of the issues that I think would really need to take into account that it's a deliberate move not to have the regulatory framework.
I think you've actually, in your response, touched on both Tutsi's and Nicole's intervention. Prof, I'd like to bring you in if you've got any reflections.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. So,
Sure.
I don't have a lot of hope for the whatever it is, this policy statement, the white paper from the Department. It seems it's pretty clearly about empowering South Africans' control over the people who don't have citizenship. I think it's going to strengthen already, the same problems we already see there. But I also don't think I think that there's a kind of hopefulness to this regulatory argument that, it's going to work in Ghana, it's going to work in Sudan, that's the place where but look at Sudan, right? They had the furthest along the line. This has kind of broken the state completely. The former army in Himiti, who was really the representative of the artisanal miners, they're now basically blowing the whole country up. I think it's partly about us being a bit, we need to be a bit more kind of consciously and theoretically pessimistic about what the state can actually manage. And the world in which we live in, I'm afraid. I don't mean to be, people say this to me all the time, you can't constantly pitch a Jeremiah ad. You have to be a bit more optimistic and positive. I think that's important. But let's also be aware that this is a really difficult problem, and it's mostly demographic, right? The 20th century history of South Africa, it's 20-fold increase in population. It's extremely difficult to manage that. And what we're seeing now is exactly the same things are happening on the continent. Very large population growth in all of these areas, no work. People are going to push for whatever they can to find to do it. So I do think there are things we can do, but I'm afraid for me it's mainly about going to the rich countries and saying, unless you address the welfare issues in these countries where people are desperate and poor and tens of millions, you're also going to face a lot of problems. They're coming across the Mediterranean for you as well, right? So that's my main view on this. It's got to be dealt with globally. We can't fix it in Johannesburg or in Welkom. Just on this particular question of provenance, the problem is gold is just designed, its whole purpose is about being hidden. You give somebody a gold bar, they're going to shave a few tens or hundredths of a gram off it and give it to somebody else. You really can't make that work. The World Gold Council keep promising they can do this because what they'd love to do is block off the 50% of gold production that's coming from the artisanal miners. They love to put that in a special container and say only buy from Glencore or Anglo Gold. Of course they want to do that, but it's just, it's not going to happen. The best example of why not, this refinery that owned by, I hope he's not in the room, that's the Zimbabwean gangster, the rapper refinery here. What did they do? They bought Krugerrands,
And
they
melted them
melted it
down.
into gold to make it look like it was artisanal, because they knew then they would get the VAT refund. You know, it's money. This stuff is money, but it's money in the old school. This is the same thing that, you know, the traders are doing at Rand Merchant Bank, but people are thinking about how to do it physically. And it's because gold is money, and they really know what they're doing with it, and where the arbitrage opportunities are. That's how we need to be thinking about this thing. Gold is the same as an interest rate swap, or, you know, some derivative object that you can really find all sorts of tricky ways of managing. And the only way we're going to fix that is if people basically, if the Americans stop being, bloody stupid about managing the way their debts, so that people calm down and they buy American government debt, and also so that, you know, they don't, Putin is a bad guy, he's terrible, I'm very angry with him, furious. But the big mistake was thinking that you could seize $400 billion worth of dollar-denominated assets without causing a global panic about people's trust in the gold supply. Sorry, I know that's not what you want to hear, Nicole.
So I'm aware of a certain privilege on this panel, which is that I'm not an activist or an academic, and no one ever expects me not to be
Anything you say,
negative. I can just be fucking negative. It's great. And it's also a privilege to sit on a panel with subject specialists. Like I visit the domains that you guys are specialists in and experts in, and I learn from you. So it's really nice to sit up here with you. On the regulation of it, I feel like, you know, gold mining is a 19th century activity.
Yeah, it is.
And I think that the mining of gold in South Africa, with the current like political and economic frameworks and the depth of the gold, requires a 19th century approach to labor that wouldn't be like tolerable anymore. So I'm genuinely curious I completely hear you that there should be a regulatory framework to keep out some of the skellums who make like this completely violent and insane. But I also don't know, maybe I lack the imagination for what a regulatory framework looks like that safely takes artisanal miners 2 kilometers underground. And by the way, I keep talking about the verticality of this thing, but there's also like a horizontal dimension where there's these levels that spread for miles and miles and miles. You know, you could walk from one end of Joburg to the other underground, cross-cutting between these different layers, and they've all caved in because they haven't been rehabilitated for a long time. And they don't have, the noxious gases accumulate in them, they flood. So there's a huge capital like investment needed to make these places like vaguely safe to work in. So I just don't know what it looks like to safely take artisanal miners into that space where any government regulatory agency be like, cool, like we can get behind this. And then,
I think it's very possible. Let me interject.
well, that's fantastic.
I think for me, it's a matter of harnessing. Now we have new technology, and now it takes me right to the work that we do at Wits Mining Institute. We actually looking, we have some very broad research that looks into, we term it digimining, how to exploit the contemporary or, you know, digital innovation for the benefit of those who want to go underground, but also involved in the sector. Yes, we understand these health and safety issues. So if our research is to assist only big mining corporates, because that research obviously is going to benefit.
I'm sure they're funding it, right?
Yes, they are funding, but
Yeah.
why doesn't it also have to benefit the ordinary small-scale players? Once regulated, so the point is, whatever.
I mean, I like that vision
Listen,
of, I like that vision
I'm
of the future.
I'm trying to be optimistic now.
As you must.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why should we only focus everything around, you know, large-scale mining? For me, whatever study that I would prioritize should, at the end of the day, benefit the ordinary, small miner on the ground who is not mining for the sake of making huge profits or buying all these mansions and whatever, but who is trying to earn a living, make a living through, you know, whatever.
I completely agree with you. That would be fantastic. But
Yeah.
I just
of
don't know
course.
if anyone's going to do it. you
But
know?
I'm just thinking around, that's very thought-provocative, your question, that how the kind of framework that we need to rethink, it has to, whatever we are doing for the big mining companies, let me close it this way, should apply to small-scale miners. Because for me, there's nothing that is called illegal mining. It's artisanal small-scale mining. It only becomes illegal because of the kind of mineral that is being mined. If I'm mining clay, nobody cares. But yet clay is very important. We all can see what everything that has been made by clay here.
I want to make two quick points. Can I quickly interrupt you?
Sure.
So quickly, I'll be very super quick. First is there's this thing called the Dodd-Frank Act. So it's just an act, a US Congress Act that says we're going to track the provenance of all these minerals, but not cobalt and not gold, right? They're supposed to gold too. So the truth is, everybody wants to be kind. Everybody wants to care. The problem is caring isn't going to help us manage this problem. The honest truth. It doesn't matter really what the stake. These problems are immense, and in many ways, Kimon, the difficulty of gold mining is the thing that protects us. You can't just go outside in the parking lot and dig for gold in South Africa. You've got to go down, and it's extremely dangerous. So in many ways, we're protected from this big problem that is afflicting the continent. But we shouldn't sit here and say, you know, we're going to fix it if we design a regulatory framework that applies to Welkom. Because those guys are coming. You know, if they'll come across the border because they are desperate. And we have to have a plan that fixes their economies. Sorry.
Thank you.
Of course, the regulatory framework is not everything.
I don't want to lose the last question that we had from Juliet. And Kimon, I know in your article, you do a bit of this tracking for us, this route to market. How does something in a piece of rock end up? If I could ask you very quickly to just...
Oh, super quickly, it gets laundered into illicit supply chains, is my understanding, with very, very sophisticated networks of front companies that efface the source of the gold. All the huge gold shops that you see everywhere. I've always wondered, like, surely not that many people are selling their second-hand watches. Like, I'm sure a few of them are.
VAT registration. They don't actually buy and sell gold.
And so there's like there's some little loopholes, and there's white-collar businessmen who are very adept at buying in gold. And Amabungane obtained a confidential SARS investigation. You mentioned rapid trading, but 2 companies alone, just through laundering gold and melting down Krugerrands to export them and get this VAT refund, which is insane that's like a financially lucrative thing to do. Just 2 of them claimed VAT refunds.
8 billion rand or $8 billion. How much?
It was 0.5% of South Africa's entire tax budget for that year. So think of all the taxes that all of us pay and every corporation pays, and then 1/200th of that, 2 companies was like, actually,
go long.
Actually, we'll take that back because we've been selling all of the second-hand gold, but it's all Zama gold. Which, like, I'm also like respect criminals, like well played.
So that's a good place to...
If you can take 1/200th of the revenue.
I can see hands up for another round of
but the
question
biggest
already.
Zamas are the big mining companies. Can we agree?
Totally. I mean, they pioneered
I
it.
don't agree
Big,
either.
illegal. Yeah,
This
I
sounds
think
like
they
another
inspired
round.
them.
I saw one hand. Do you have more hands for the next round? Here we go.
I was telling the people I'm forgetting my questions, hint, panelists. Let's try and tone it down with our answers, 1,000 notches. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mpho Mokaleng. I'm from one of the banks. I'm not going to tell you which one.
Wow.
Because I might ask something and then tomorrow you will close your bank accounts. I don't want that. I have I wanted to say 1.5. It's been a long day. I've been typing 1.5 questions. The first question, and you touched on it, I wanted to touch on financial crime. That's obviously because I work for a bank. And you touched on it. Tax evasion is actually a financial crime, and basically that is what those 2 gold companies were doing. But apart from financial crime, money laundering, my interest is also around terrorist financing. 100% I agree with you that when these people take up these roles, these Zamazamas take up these roles, more often than not it's because of desperation. But have we done in-depth investigation to try and understand Who are the people at the top of the value chain, and where is the money going? Are we 100% sure, if we've done our investigations, that this money is not going to terrorist organizations? You mentioned Mozambique, and I think that's one of the stuff that you've researched. And we've heard now, and we've seen also throughout the media, that Mozambique also is a stronghold for terrorist organizations. So has there been any in-depth investigation to make sure that whatever we get here is not funneled or funding this terrorist organization? Now to my half question, which I will divide into quarters. Yeah, they talk a lot, so I need to squeeze everything in. The first quarter is, are we in this zama-zama situation because the predecessors or the pre-owners of the mines did not close them off thoroughly? And I'm making an inference. I'm from the Northern Cape, Kimberley. I don't know if I've lost my colored accent, but most people when I speak, they say, but you look black, are you colored? Because I have a colored accent. And in Kimberley, we have this big hole right there. It's not hidden. It's not in Kakamas. It's not in Griquastad. It's right in the middle of the CBD. 5 meters from that big hole is the taxi rank that my grandmother uses almost every day. So that hole is growing on a daily basis to a point where they've tried to close it off. But because we know the taxi drivers are also a phenomenon in South Africa, they don't listen to anyone, they still pass through that section that has been closed off. So are we in this situation because what the mining companies did, they came, they took whatever that they wanted to do, and they left the nonsense behind for us to suffer, and they didn't clean it out properly? My other question, the last one, I'm going to try and bundle it up, relates to what you said, Kimon, that, yeah, but, and I'm paraphrasing largely, you can correct me when you answer. You said, but what are these people doing wrong? It's not like they're not contributing towards the economy. They're buying, and I think I read your article, 80 buckets of KFC and things like that. So we really need to understand, we don't want to paint this picture that we are allowing them to do what they're doing because seemingly they're contributing towards the fiscus of the country. We all pay VAT. When you go buy KFC, you pay VAT. But in addition to paying VAT, there's an individual income tax that you are paying. You know about this when you get your pay slip if you're working. That's the element that they are not paying for. And that's why I am pro, we need to regulate this so that we can get each and everything that is due from the minerals and the land of this country. Linking it up to, I don't want money leaving this country and funding terrorist organizations just because they contribute towards one KFC in one isolated region. And then,
Thanks,
Dr.
for,
Janet.
I think we've got two and a half questions
Yes.
now.
Cool.
Can we close it off there? Good.
Cool.
Do we have any more hands? I see one hand. Yeah, Zach.
My name's David. I just developed a kind of hypothesis now that, from just attending this, because I've been, following this kind of narrative or, what's the developments around Zama-Zamas, and there's been a lot of kind of heat around the issue that's been generated quite recently, and I'm just, so now, but the kind of impression that I'm getting is that in many ways, that economy doesn't actually directly threaten existing economic interests in South Africa. And that's a very kind of crude gloss on the way I'm kind of understanding this issue now. And so I'm just trying to understand because, I'm kind of interested in crime, and when does crime become important? When does it kind of matter and that kind of thing? And so, but I have a sense that it isn't really that this form of illegality, or whether it's illegality or not, it's obviously something that's disputed, but is it in fact itself a concern? It's more, seems to be that the kind of xenophobic sentiment in South Africa has picked up on this issue as being, a critical kind of threat to the survival of the country or something, and And in some ways, the presentation of this kind of economy as a threat to South Africa is driven more by the kind of xenophobic sentiment than by anything else. I wondered if that's a reasonable observation to make, or it's just, what is driving this kind of sense of this kind of threatening our economy or our country.
Thank you so much, David. You are so kind.
Do we have any more? I see one more. We can take maybe 2 last questions before we sort of go eat.
Hi there, I'm Victoria. There's so much in my head about the difference, the different approaches and the different problems that we've got here. And one of the things that really strikes me is that we're trying to balance all sorts of constitutional rights. We've got, the people. Where are the people from? Where are the miners from? Where are the off-takers from? What are the different rights at play here? Who are the different regulatory kind of bodies who are responsible for this? We've got Home Affairs, we've got DMRE, we've got the law enforcement. I'm a property owner, I'm a lawyer, I've got a lot of exposure to zama-zamas, to problems with immigration. And I guess when we're talking about a regulatory framework, we have a regulatory environment in which all mining happens in South Africa. Mineral rights are owned by the state. People are supposed to apply to the DMRE for the right to mine those minerals. Those rights come with certain responsibilities, which include safety, which include landowner, property owners' rights, which include the rights of employees or workers to a safe working environment. And I don't know that a different regulatory or parallel regulatory framework gets the miners safely underground. I love the idea that there are new technologies, but what you said, Doctor, is that there's such a lacuna, there is such a lack of will at all levels, and possibly that's where so many of the vested interests in the end product of this autism mining are going. But how do we get, that seems to me to be, while there is this lacuna, while there is this absolute lack of interest, whether it's because there's foreign workers, whether it's because there's a lot of money, how do we get that working? Because we can't scrap that system. We can't have a formal system and an informal system working together. So my question is, how do we get the institutions that are supposed to take responsibility for this to take responsibility for it? Because that's
You know the answer, though,
where it comes from. Home Affairs, DMRE, safety and security. How do we do that? We can't generate a parallel system. So that's my contribution.
Thank you. Do we have a last interjection or comment before we take it to the panel? See one last one.
Hi, so my name is Justin. It doesn't matter what I do, I'm a student. So I suppose my question ties to, I think, Victoria, what she was just speaking about. And this is a question specifically for Kimon. I was interested in your experience of to what extent does the government actually know about and is complicit in this kind of non-regulation, because it's from your experience and your discussion about what's going on, it seems like a very elaborate process. There's a whole bunch of logistics that are involved, and it seems extremely unlikely that the government does not know about this. And so I suppose the question is, in your own experience, to what extent have government officials almost been complicit in the non-regulation and the lack of interest in regulating this kind of industry?
Thanks, Justin. Kimon, we'll remind you this is being live streamed, so your free legal advice is...
I forgot about that.
Maybe,
oh my goodness.
Maybe we can start just going back to and impose questions. I don't know how much of you've been following the gold, but following the illicit financial flows is a different question. And maybe tying that together with accountability, and I think that's a really important question of the mine owners themselves, and these are abandoned mines, but the dereliction and the state that they're left in. I'll open that to the panel at large, just our thoughts in respect of that.
Can I start super quickly, because I was paraphrased slightly inaccurately.
Go ahead.
So 100% an illicit gold economy is bad in very many ways, including tax evasion and all these things. I want to be very clear about that. So I just wanted to clarify where I'm coming from the perspective of a community where illicit gold mining becomes a major pillar of the economy. I think from that, someone in that community, I think they have like this kind of ambivalent relationship with it. And I think that's part of why we see these cycles of like, we're going to chase all the zamas out, but then they come back in because they're keeping the tuck shops going. So that's very much what I'm speaking to. It's not a victimless crime financially. It's tied into high-level organized crime, and maybe you guys can talk more about that. But like you're spot on. I think there are links to terrorists and stuff like that. Like we know this because gold is such a untraceable, endlessly meltdownable kind of thing. That's what people like it for. So I just wanted to clear that. And then there was the question of the open minds, like, of course. Like, so like sometimes people like want to know what my take is. Am I pro, am I anti? And I sometimes get stuck on these kind of panels because I'm just like, I just want to understand why this thing happened. And when I look at the Zama thing that we've got, to me it just looks like if you had to guess what would happen, if you over decades brought millions of people from across Africa to work in these mines, and you dug them really deep, and then you shut them down, but you didn't close them properly, and you left gold in the bottom, like, let's like guess what might happen. Like, I just think this is a completely logical outcome. And part of what I try and do as a journalist is like just look at that in its kind of moral ambiguities. I don't know the numbers of the shafts that were left open, but Welkom had 50 and they didn't close any of them properly. You know, that's 50 shafts, plus ventilation channels, plus ducts for cabling. There's like hundreds of entry points into this like interconnected tunnel network with literal money down there for anyone risk hungry enough to go and get it. Of course they're going to go get it. And companies could have spent way more money doing proper rehab. By the way, all these mine dumps that you see around Joburg, they blow radioactive waste across all the townships that are situated downwind, which was an apartheid town planning kind of thing as well. Like Welkom, one instance, they had the mine dumps, they situated Welkom in a way where the prevailing winds would like blow away from Welkom. They're like, where should we put the black township? Well, I guess we should put it there. So like, the environmental and sort of rehabilitation legacy of the mining companies, I think, is appalling, and an absolutely like central driver of this economy among all these other drivers. I guess that's my answer to those questions.
Thanks, Kimon. Any other reflections? Okay. I do want to move to David's point, because I think that was an interesting question about the drivers of sentiment and what's really behind what we're seeing dominating headlines, if I can call it. Or
I think you had more to say to that question as well, though. Huh? Did you have more to say to that question?
Victoria.
Oh, okay, sure.
So I think for me, Keith, I totally hear you before I even get back to about the question around do we really need a policy framework? What is it? For me, I still maintain that I think we really need this regulatory framework in place. How do you define illegality in the absence of a policy framework? Let me just ask, because for me, the laws, yes, somebody said there are laws and whatever that have to guide, that provide guidelines. Those laws, let me be honest and be frank, from my review of those particular laws. They were actually crafted around big mining, corporate mining. Nothing for ASM, this Zamazama, it's an emerging sector on its own. And Victoria, I must say, thanks for that thought-provoking question, but at the same time, I will share maybe if I can get some time, because I don't want to take people more of your time now. There is an intricate relationship between informal and formal. And the reality is that this is what we are living right now. You know, if we think there is what is happening in the abandoned mines is completely detached from what's happening in the formal mines, then that's not, we need to go back to the drawing table. I think in his opening remarks, Kimon is like even shocked. He raised something very fundamental to say, who takes food down?
Yeah.
Where does the mercury come from? Where all this, you know, if you look at the labor process itself, you'll actually see an intricate, strong linkages between these two. They're not parallel. They're actually one part of a continuum. I don't even know which one is on 0 or minus, which one begins from -1, but they feed into each other. It's really a very sophisticated industry that would need some time to really get to the bottom of it. And that takes me quickly to the question from Komi, I think from the bank. I totally understand why you're raising these very important concerns. But for me, I think the moment we bring in the picture of terrorism, we completely miss it around the conversation that I think we are trying to push here around the regulatory framework. Terrorism comes through because of that negligence that I highlighted earlier, that if the powers that be are really serious about what we need to do, then they shouldn't scapegoat. Obviously, when anyone wants to demonize me, they will have to look for a word, you know, what we call labeling, stigmatization. I don't know, my dear fellow panelists, when you went to the sites, did you see anyone who looked like a potential terrorist?
No, they thought I was.
That wasn't the question. Yeah. That's not really the question.
No. My question, now let me get the Keith, what I'm trying to say. The very same terrorism, it still goes back to the big giants. The people who are exploiting, these people are getting exploited. That's the case I'm trying to make. Kimon, you made very important observations and remarks earlier also around what happens underground. We can't run away from human trafficking. Those people who would spend 2 years underground, you won't be surprised that perhaps they were human trafficked. We can't run away from human rights issues that are very fundamental simply because we also want to address some violations that are taking place. It goes without saying, and I'm not apologetic about it, as a feminist activist scholar, I wouldn't condone any gender-based violence that happens in those spaces. But why is it happening? It's happening because the sector is just nobody's land. You come and do whatever, like says the fair, you can come and rape a child living in those spaces or women and just, with impunity, get away with it. So we are not trying to condone criminality or anything that is by law illegal. I think we need to be very clear and ground that. I would want to say it up front. We can't also really claim that there are no human rights violations that are perpetuated by those that we are trying to, perhaps advance or fight for their rights. I think Kimon said it very well, that there are various different role players who are coming in for various reasons. And by so doing, we can't completely abandon the whole sector simply because of a few rotten eggs, a few rotten tomatoes. I think even in the Bible, those who follow the Bible, they said in Gomorrah, if there is still one person that can make me serve, let me do that. So I'll leave it there. So honestly, we still need this framework in place because everybody's taking advantage. Human rights violations with impunity, without accountability at the end of the day. So let's revisit that framework. I know it might sound like an abstract idea, but for the people that are actually spending their time in those spaces, this would mean a lot because it talks about recognition. The first thing for you to be covered by the law is to be recognized that whatever you're doing is actually classified as work. It goes back to those debates around domestic work, recognition, sex work, all those kind of issues. I don't want to bring those into the conversation, but everyone who is vulnerable, obviously there'll be, nobody would care. And obviously they'll be further demonized even by us academics. I was actually called a Zamazama, even right now I'm called Dr. Zamazama at Vets Day, simply because of the work that I was trying to do. Are you safe there? What kind of, it's like I'm actually spending much of my time with these dodgy people. And yet,
Thank you, Doctor.
yeah, thank you.
Prof,
Yeah, I
Come
don't
in to
disagree with
respond
Janet.
to
I think
the
the
rest
framework
of-
is definitely better than no framework.
Yes.
I worry specifically, and I think it's a subject for another panel, I think it's going to heighten the wording as it is really, I mean, I've never seen in a framework things that are aimed specifically at South Africans as citizens in order to deny the other people who are participating in that economy any recognition. So, Janet, let's have that discussion another night. I think the offshoring issue and I think everybody should be saying to the Chinese and the Americans, let's police dark spots offshore, the Cayman Islands, the places where people put money illegally, and start with Dubai. I mean, obviously, that's where all of this money is going. Dubai should be under much more pressure than it is. Not so much, I don't think we can say, perhaps we can, but you can't sell gold in Dubai, but certainly if you deposit it in a bank account in Dubai, it should be flagged immediately as suspicious by all other banks, and the banks can police and regulate each other. They do it all the time. I just worry that this SWIFT Ukraine thing has turned that into a really risky area, but it's where I would put if I was going to devote my life to a single area of policing and regulation, it would be that. Obviously, the police force has got to do its job. And that's a question for you, Kimon. I mean, One Eye is in jail, actually. We need to admit this. We need to acknowledge. They did prosecute him. They did successfully put him in prison. That, to me, is really interesting, that all the things you say about him having basically the powers, the levers, almost all the whole economy, they still put him in prison. So I don't want to sound too hopeful, but isn't there something there that says to us that if we really want to back something in South Africa, we've got to repair the police force? It has to do its job. We spend, whatever it is, 11, 12% of the budget on it. It's got to do a better job than it does. And nothing's going to work unless we get the cops to actually prosecute people.
I'll speak to why One Eye's in jail. One Eye's in jail because of a private security investigator employed by the large mining company
that's
there.
very interesting. But you didn't put that in that paper. I mean,
Because I have off-the-record sources. 80% of that story was sourced by people who
That's
couldn't be
very
named.
interesting. Okay, it's pretty sad.
So the entire case against One Eye was built by a private investigative force. So to the question of does the government know? I'll speak to specifics. I'll speak to Welkom. A police reservist I hung out with there estimated 70% of the police force were in the pocket of One Eye. And I was like, he's probably exaggerating. But then I spoke to some senior detectives and they sort of laughed and they're like, it's probably higher. The way that One Eye was caught, firstly, I think there was only enough political will to go over him because he kind of went a bit before and started murdering so many people.
Yeah, okay. And
so then there was this thing where these private Harmony Gold investigators could go to the provincial command and say, we need a special operation. They brought in 50 cops from Bloemfontein and they stationed them there for like 2 years. I think they're still there. It's called Operation Knockout. The logo's a fist. They're like, we're going to knock them out. Because they couldn't rely on any cops, because as soon as they did any operation, like word would leak out. So he is in jail. I don't think he would be in jail. He certainly wouldn't be in jail if it wasn't for this private investigative capacity. And he wouldn't be in jail if he hadn't killed so many people and there was such a case to make. Now, it's not just police who knew about it. So when we talk like, who's the government? It's an abstract term. But a story that got cut from the magazines, the New Yorker is very fastidious about fact-checking. And this one killed me that it had to go out. The mayor who was in charge at the time of the Eskom deal, his name was Spielman, bit of a dodgy dude. When he was inaugurated, Spielman received the mayoral chain of Welkom. which was forged with the establishment of this town, which was this grand statement by the Anglo-American corporations: we're going to build the perfect gold mining company town. Spare no cost, except for the black people, but we're going to build this incredible town. We're going to build this lavish civic center, and we're going to show the world. And this was 2 years before the National Party won the 1948 election, 2 years afterwards, I think, basically at the same time. So it became like the showpiece of the white Afrikaner nationalist project. We're going to lure people to this barren Free State by giving them such awesome jobs. We're going to build polo lawns, we're going to build swimming pools. And to commemorate the town, they forged this chain with it was like something out of Tolkien, it was like this mythical chain with gold from each of the founding mines in these discs. It was beautiful. It was never seen again after Spielman's inauguration. Its value was approximately the same amount of money that One Eye told me that he paid for the Eskom bill.
Ah, there you are.
But I was never able to really fact check this, and so it's maybe a little bit conspiratorial. But I will say that I got very strong on the record interviews, because we didn't use the anecdote and because of trying to cut things for space. One Eye used to arrive at the city center and go to meetings in the mayor's office with his own bodyguards. So the government knew everything. And I guess I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kimon, and thank you to the panel. Nicole, I
Nice
think
one.
all accounts, there's a need for maybe a second roundtable at some point. But if I can, I want to, we're happy to close off questions too.
Well, I sense a real energy in this audience.
Thanks, Chair.
I'm not the only one who's found tonight really fascinating for the real richness of different perspectives. Do I need that? I didn't. Okay. Really fascinating, as I said, for the different perspectives and the thoughtfulness of responses. Tonight, it seemed to me, was not necessarily about finding answers, but about trying to understand the complexity of a subject. Professor Breckenridge used the phrase immense challenge. Dr. Munakamwe, you challenged us to think about mining not just on a spectrum of legal versus illegal, but to think about legality versus artisanal, and even within that, how zama-zamas are on a spectrum. These are really complex issues, but it is so important for us to at least start thinking about them, because this is but one of the myriad of socio-economic challenges we face in South Africa. And as a society, we tend to put off looking for solutions and put off until something explodes. And then the danger is that a short-termism or popularism or a reactive measure seems to be the only thing that we have left. And so while tonight wasn't necessarily about answers and an answer to a regulatory framework, and I do hope that we have a second roundtable, and I'm so glad that the HSF was able to start shedding a light on this and raising an unpalatable reality. This is what civil society does. We exist in South Africa in a vibrant civil society which is unafraid to shed light on unpalatable truths and talk about unpopular causes. We at the HSF are part of this ecosystem. And so you will be aware, if you've been following us, as Nicole has said, you will have been aware of the victimization and harassment that we have been going through. You would have been aware of the campaigns of misinformation, the intimidation of our staff, and the real misogyny leveled against our very brave executive director. I take heart from your attendance here tonight, and I read into your attendance a sign of support for us. So I'd like to say I'm very grateful, not just to the richness of the panelists here tonight and Chimera as facilitator, but also from your being here. I also would like to pay a special tribute. We do have many friends of the foundation who support us financially as well as morally and through other means. But I'd also like to pay a special sign of gratitude to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, the FNF, who have long supported our roundtables, and you're a great supporter. Thank you. Finally, I want to thank our HSF staff who have put together this function, and you don't necessarily see all of them. They're the ones who are at the front line, as I say, of this misinformation campaign. And so Nasima, not sure where she is, and Chris, and Ezekiel, and Devashni, and Sophia, and Juliet, thank you for your hard work. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight, and I wish you a good night. Thank you.